At 1,100 feet beneath a German hill, an American sergeant found a Torah scroll wrapped in gray packing cloth. The SS had not destroyed it. They had numbered it. The crate was wedged behind 37 other crates in a cold potash chamber outside the town of Vacha, near the Thuringian border. Salt dust covered the lid. A black inventory code had been stenciled across one side with the same neat hand used on museum cases, ammunition boxes, and office furniture. But the smaller label was pasted crookedly near the hinge. Mainz West End Congregation. Received November 1938. The sergeant stared at those words until the mind lamps blurred. His name was Daniel Weiss. He was 26 years old. He wore the uniform of the United States Army. And the last time he had heard the word West End spoken inside a synagogue, his father had been standing beside the ark, singing the morning portion in a voice Daniel still heard whenever he woke before dawn. Now that synagogue was ash, and the ash had a file number. Daniel had been underground for almost 4 hours when the recovery team opened Chamber 12. The entrance had been blasted into a side passage and hidden behind a false wall of timber and salt sacks. The first chamber held Reichsbank currency. The second held paintings stacked in padded racks. The third held silver, coin boxes, foreign bonds, and canvas bags marked with ministry seals. Then one of the engineers cut the wire on a narrow wooden door. Behind it, the war changed shape. Not louder, colder. Rows of crates ran into the dark, stacked almost to the ceiling. Some were marked Prague, some Vienna, some Amsterdam, some Salonika. Some had synagogue names. Some had only community numbers, as if the people had already been reduced to filing locations before the objects ever arrived. Torah crowns, silver pointers, prayer books, burial society ledgers, marriage registers, children's school records. Fragments of communities the Reich had tried to erase from life while preserving their objects for proof that the erasure had happened. Daniel was not supposed to touch anything except documents. He was there because he spoke German better than most of the officers, because German had been the language of his childhood, his schoolbooks, his father's jokes, his mother's shopping lists, and the warning shouted at his family from a Berlin railway platform in 1937. The army had made him useful with that language. Prisoner interrogations, captured orders, depot inventories, railway manifests. He had read enough German paperwork to understand that the most terrible words were often the calmest ones. Transferred, Prusset, disposed of, accounted for. But he had never seen his own childhood written that way. Until Chamber 12. Daniel Weiss had been born in Mainz in 1919, in a flat above a bookbinder's shop not far from the Rhine. His father, Elias Weiss, served as cantor at the West End Synagogue for 18 years. Their apartment smelled of lamp oil, wool coats, old paper, and the bread his mother set under a cloth every Friday before sunset. Daniel was a quiet boy. He liked mechanical drawings. He liked maps. He liked the hidden structure underneath visible things. His father used to tell him that a scroll was not holy because it was old. It was holy because generation after generation had carried it forward without letting the chain break. In 1936, Elias Weiss stopped saying that Germany would return to itself. In January of 1937, The family left for America with 3 suitcases, 2 prayer books, and a silver kiddush cup wrapped in Daniel's school scarf. They did not bring the synagogue with them. No one could. On the morning after Kristallnacht, a neighbor in Mainz wrote to Daniel's aunt in Zurich. The West End synagogue had burned from the inside. The ark doors were torn down. The scrolls were gone. Not burned, the letter said. Gone. For 7 years Daniel imagined fire. Fire was easier. Fire meant hatred had been honest for once. But the label on the crate said something worse. Received. Not stolen. Not desecrated. Received. Like a shipment of chairs. He lifted the packing cloth with both hands. The scroll beneath it was darkened at the edges, but intact. Around one wooden roller was a narrow strip of faded blue thread, tied in a clumsy repair Daniel recognized before he understood why. His mother had tied thread like that on everything. Bundles of letters, kitchen linen, his father's worn prayer shawl when the fringe tore. Daniel stood in the salt chamber with an American helmet on his head and his father's synagogue in his hands, and for the first time since landing in Europe, he could not make his fingers stop shaking. Captain James Rowley found him there. Rowley was the legal officer attached to the recovery detail, a former prosecutor from Baltimore who had spent the last 6 months teaching soldiers that German paperwork was not debris. It was evidence. He did not ask Daniel whether he was all right. That would have been useless. He asked what the label meant. Daniel told him. Rowley listened. Then he looked at the inventory number on the crate and said the sentence that turned grief into a weapon. Then there is a ledger. The ledger was upstairs. It sat in a locked cabinet inside the mine administration office, bound in black cloth, with index tabs cut so cleanly they looked almost beautiful. It had been found that morning beside a stack of transfer receipts and 3 sharpened pencils. The man who had kept it was already in American custody. His name was Otto Kroll. He was 46 years old, an SS administrative officer from Kassel, trained before the war as a museum registrar. He had never commanded troops in battle. He had never worn mud on his boots unless the weather forced him to. He had built a career out of order, classification, storage, and the quiet belief that a man who touched only the paper could not be accused of touching the crime. Kroll had been assigned to the Kaltenborn Depot in early 1944 after Allied bombing made Berlin storage less secure. His task was to receive cultural property already seized by other offices, assign depot numbers, document origin points, and protect the material until it could be moved again. That was how he explained it to the first 2 officers who questioned him. He received, he cataloged, he stored, he did not acquire. He repeated that last part with care, as if the word acquire were a fence he could stand behind. Captain Rowley understood the fence. Daniel understood the handwriting. At 2:30 that afternoon, Otto Kroll was brought into the mine director's office. The room still smelled of tobacco, damp wool, and coal stove smoke. A map of the shafts hung crookedly on one wall. Outside the window, American trucks idled in the yard, their engines coughing in the cold April air. Kroll sat across from Daniel with his back straight and his hands folded. He looked tired but not frightened. Not yet. Daniel opened a notebook. In German he asked Kroll to state his name, rank, and duty at the Kaltenborn repository. Kroll answered smoothly. Otto Kroll, SS Untersturmführer, administrative custodian of transferred cultural materials. Daniel wrote it down. He asked whether Kroll had personally taken part in removals from synagogues, libraries, or Jewish community offices. Kroll said no. He said he had no authority over acquisition teams. He said he only maintained order after materials reached the facility. His voice was even, professional, almost bored. Daniel nodded. Then he placed the black ledger on the table. The room changed. It was not a dramatic change. Kroll did not gasp. He did not leap back. He did not confess. Only his eyes moved. Once to the cover, once to Daniel's hand, once to the door. Daniel opened the ledger to the M section, Mainz. There were 14 lines under that city. Each line had an origin site, a date, a crate group, an item class, a receiving signature, and a transfer officer. No poetry, no rage, no blood, just columns. Daniel placed his finger on the 5th line. Depot number KB12/183, he said. Kroll looked down. Daniel asked if the entry corresponded to the crate currently stored in Chamber 12, Row C, Stack 4. Kroll said yes. Daniel asked what origin was listed. Kroll swallowed. Israelitische Gemeinde Mainz-Westend. Daniel asked for the transfer date. November 15th, 1938. 3 days after the smoke still hung over the synagogue roof. Daniel wrote the date slowly, even though the date was already printed in front of him. Then he asked Kroll to read the officer's name on the transfer receipt. Kroll did not answer at once. For the first time, the orderly man had discovered a disorder he could not file away, because the ledger did not say history. It said who. Daniel turned the receipt so the signature faced Kroll. Read it. Kroll read the name. SS Hauptscharführer Martin Bender. Daniel wrote it down, not quickly, not with rage, with the same careful handwriting Kroll had used to build the system. Then Daniel moved to the next flagged line, Worms, November 16th, Community Archive, 22 boxes, Transfer Officer, Ernst Wolfram, next line, Castle, November 18th. Ritual Silver and School Records. Transfer Officer, Paul Mertens, next line, Hanau, December 2nd. Prayer Books and Burial Society Registers. Transfer Officer, Friedrich Saal. The interrogation lasted 41 minutes. By the end, Daniel had 12 names, 9 ranks, 8 cities, and enough cross-references to connect 3 separate SS cultural property offices to the objects below ground. Kroll had given the answers himself. That was the part Rowley wanted. Not a witness guessing, not a victim remembering through pain, not an American accusation, the custodian reading his own machine aloud. When they reached the final flagged entry, Daniel closed the ledger. Kroll seemed relieved. That was his mistake. Daniel rested one hand on the cover and said very quietly that the Torah scroll in depot number KB12/183 had belonged to the synagogue where his father had served as cantor. Kroll said nothing. Daniel said his father had sung from that ark every Sabbath morning for 18 years. Kroll looked at the ledger, not at him. Daniel said the SS had burned the building and saved the scroll because a museum someday needed relics from a people it intended no longer to meet. Still, Kroll said nothing. So Daniel gave him the truth in the language Kroll respected. The record is complete, Daniel said. That is your problem. Kroll's mouth tightened. Daniel continued. You listed the origin. You listed the date. You listed the officer. You listed the receiving authority. You listed the storage chamber. You signed the custody transfer. You built the chain. Krall's hands were no longer folded. They were flat on the table. Daniel stood and picked up the notebook. Captain Rowley will be pleased, he said. You kept excellent records. Then he left the room. By evening, the ledger was wrapped in oilcloth, sealed in an evidence envelope, and placed under armed guard beside the transfer receipts. Rowley sent a dispatch to the War Crimes Documentation Unit describing the contents of Chamber 12 and the administrative structure that had preserved them. The language was dry because legal language had to be dry, but anyone who read it carefully could see what had happened. The SS had tried to turn murdered communities into a collection. Then one of its own collectors had documented the theft so thoroughly that the collection became a map of the crime. 4 days later, Daniel went back underground with a monuments officer and 2 engineers. They did not open every crate. There were too many. They marked the rows, photographed the labels, matched crate groups to ledger pages, and built a chain of custody strong enough to survive men who would later claim confusion, distance, obedience, or paperwork. Especially paperwork. Because paperwork was where the Reich hid. It hid the burned synagogue inside the word origin. It hid armed seizure inside the word transfer. It hid vanished families inside the word community. It hid looting inside the word custody. But hidden things do not disappear just because a clerk writes them neatly. Sometimes the neatness preserves the outline. Otto Krall was moved through the Allied detention system that summer. In questioning, he kept his defense. He had received materials. He had maintained them. He had not chosen where they came from. That argument helped him less after the ledger. The records showed he knew the dates. He knew the origin sites. He knew the transfers began immediately after synagogue attacks. He knew the crates contained ritual objects, registers, school records, and community archives. He knew enough to create separate classifications for Judaica, communal property, and museum-grade silver. He had not merely stacked boxes. He had organized a disappearance. After the war, many objects from depots like Kaltenborn did not go home because home no longer existed in the way records pretended it did. A Torah scroll can be returned to a building only if there is still a congregation to receive it. A burial register can be sent back to a town only if the families named in it are still there to ask. That was the wound no ledger could close. Warehouses filled, committees argued. Survivors searched. Officers tried to match labels to addresses that had become rubble, silence, or other people's apartments. Daniel did not stay in that work long. He was discharged in early 1946 and returned to New York. He finished his engineering degree. He designed bridges, school additions, and municipal buildings that were never famous enough for newspapers. He married a nurse from Washington Heights. He had 2 children who knew that their grandfather had once been a cantor in Mainz, and that their father did not like locked filing cabinets. He never kept the blue thread. He never saw the scroll again. What he kept was a carbon copy of one evidence page and the 12 names he had written while Otto Krall read from the ledger. For years, The page stayed folded inside an envelope in the back of his desk. Not displayed, not explained, just kept. In 1987, Daniel returned to Mainz with his daughter. The West End synagogue was not there. A marker stood near the place where its entrance had been. Cars passed behind them. A boy on a bicycle rang his bell. Someone had planted flowers where Daniel remembered stone steps. His daughter asked whether he wanted a photograph. Daniel said no. Then he changed his mind. In the photograph, he is not facing the camera. He is looking down at the marker with both hands at his sides, as if touching nothing was the only respectful thing left to do. The ledger did not restore his father's synagogue. It did not bring back the families named in the registers. It did not make justice whole. But in a mine where the Reich had stored stolen sacred objects like inventory, a young American who still remembered the sound of his father's voice made the record keeper read the record out loud. Otto Kroll had built a system to preserve things after people were gone. Daniel Weiss turned the pages, and the system remembered the people anyway. The paper did not hide the crime. It became the witness.